Wait, now we are.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. We're very excited to bring back Elsa Hart for her third, right? Or is it second visit because you didn't come for White Mirror?
Because I didn't come for White Mirror, but I was here last time with Cho Shalom.
Right. So Jade Dragon Mountain and her new book. She's one of my favorite historical novelists. I really love this 18th century China series I likely do with The Librarian. So it'll be fun to talk about her most interesting new book called City of Ink. And to talk to her about it is this lovely gentleman on my right, Boyd Morrison, who today signed 500 copies of his new book with Clive Cussler called Shadow Tyrants, which goes on sale tomorrow. So Boyd will reveal to you one of the reasons why he was interested in coming and talking about historical crime, right?
Yes.
Yes. Wonderful. So I'm going to hand the microphone back.
So before we get started, Elsa, you may not know we have a little tenuous link to each other in that your brother and grandfather are named Hugh, correct?
Yes.
My first name is Hugh.
Really?
And my father's name is Hugh, so I'm Hugh Jr., but I go by Boyd, which is my middle name, so.
I didn't know. That's so
Yes.
name.
Yes. Yeah. So what Barbara was talking about is I'm interested in writing my own historical thriller, and so I hope to learn a lot from you about the process and research and everything you go to make your books as amazingly real and visceral as you do. And for everybody out there, City of Ink is a fantastic book. I loved it. It was a great mystery, but it also really gives you a sense of place in China and Beijing in particular. And you have a lot of experience living in other countries. Can you tell us about some of the places you've lived and how that informs your ability to absorb different cultures and different places and use that in your stories?
Absolutely. Good starting question. And also thank you so much for coming and for talking to me. And it's great to be back at the Poison Pen again. I grew up moving around a lot. I was born in Rome, Italy, because my father at the time was the foreign correspondent for U.S. News and World Report magazine at their little Rome bureau. So it started there. Apparently I had a lot of interest in watching lizards on the wall, but I'm afraid I didn't take in a lot more intellectually because we left when I was 2 years old. But then we moved to Moscow, where my dad was also working for U.S. News and World Report. And while I wish I could say I was following that fascinating period in world history, I was really mostly making snow castles in behind the elementary school and listening to a lot of fairy tales, Russian fairy tales. So I think without knowing it, I would probably trace back to that time an interest in storytelling and a sort of obsession with it, perhaps. And then we came back to the States for a little while, but then my high school years were spent in Prague in the Czech Republic, and I think that also Prague is kind of a unique city in that it was sustained very little destruction during World War II. So when you walk through the cobbled alleys, it's a very time travel-y sort of place. So I think I, from that time, really had a sense of historical fiction was what always drew me in the sort of novels and fiction genres.
And then when, after you got married, you married somebody who has a very interesting job that takes him to different countries. Can you talk about that?
Yes, so my husband is a biologist, and he studies high alpine plants, so basically plants that grow at the highest plants can possibly grow. And when I just finished my second year of law school, we found out that he was going to be focusing his studies for the next 5 or 6 years while he was writing his PhD dissertation on rhododendrons on a mountain called Yulang Shuishan, or Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, in southwest China. So I decided after my second year of law school that summer to go to China and study Chinese while he was in the field. So I traveled and I went to a city called Kunming, which in China is considered kind of a backwater small city in the southwest, but since it's China, its population I think is larger than that of Chicago. And I'll never forget watching Robbie and his advisor go off on the train to the mountain, leaving me by myself in Kunming. I had a stack of note cards with Chinese phrases on them, like, you know, where am I? What am I doing here? And where can I find food? But I found a roommate who was an Australian named Jane, and I lived with her and a rabbit named Villette and studied Chinese for that summer. And then after I finished law school, we ended up going back and living in China for the next 3 years. And it was there in the sort of mists of Jade Dragon Mountain that I came up with the plot for a mystery.
And yeah, so it's probably not a coincidence that the name of your first novel is Jade Dragon Mountain. Can you tell us about the process of coming up with the story and with the character of Li Du, who's the main character of City of Ink and your other 2 novels?
Yes, so we were spending about half of our time in an efficiency apartment in Lijiang, in the city itself. And Lijiang is a city that does appear in the first novel, Jade Dragon Mountain, but I call it Dayan, which is its older name. And the other half of our time we were on the mountain. And the field station on the mountain is, I think, 3,200 meters in altitude, which is about twice as high as the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado. So altitude has different effects on different people, but for me, I found it quite difficult to sleep. So at night I would listen to, I don't know if you ever have heard these, but they're great, the BBC full cast radio adaptations of Agatha Christie mysteries. So I would listen to these all night, and then during the day hike through the mountains. And I was looking at these old trade routes that you can still see that sort of contour the mountains between China and Tibet. And I was reading about these mule caravans that used to take tea from the forests of southwest China, where it can be grown, to Tibet, where it can't be grown on this arid plateau, but was and still is highly valued. So I was thinking about these trade routes, and I wondered if you could set a mystery on one of these mule caravans on the model of Murder on the Orient Express, whether that this caravan could have the same isolation as a train in a snowdrift. And that wasn't the book I ended up writing, but that's where the idea for a mystery set in that place started. And I do credit high altitude for a lot of this inspiration.
And so how did that progress? You said you started with that, but it didn't end up being that. How did you progress to creating the librarian Li Du?
So Li Du came from, I'm trying to remember now whether it was Li Du first or the Jesuits first. There were 2 big things that happened. One was I visited in Beijing on one of the times to and from Lijiang, the ancient astronomical observatory, which still stands in Beijing. It's one of the few very old historical structures that does stand. And on the roof, they're replicas now, but there used to be these astronomical instruments that were built for the Kangxi Emperor in the late 16 and early 1700s with the help of Jesuits, missionaries from the West. And so I got really into reading about that history, and that formed a lot of the plot of Jade Dragon Mountain. But the character of Li Du, my detective, came from reading about a Chinese traveler and explorer from the early 1700s whose name was Xu Shake. And Xu Shake used to take guidebooks with him as he traveled, and he would get really grumpy and angry when he found inaccuracies in the guidebooks. So he would travel around with these little 17th century guidebooks and scrawl these angry notes in the margins when, a river was slightly in the wrong place or some description was wrong. And I found this somewhat cantankerous, solitary traveler kind of stuck in my mind, and being up there in those mists of Jade Dragon Mountain, I really thought I could kind of see him through these portals, these openings in the clouds. So kind of turned into Li Du.
And you didn't make Li Du a detective, you made him a librarian. How did that come about?
I did make him a librarian, and this is an answer that is so rare because I think writing I found writing to be less easy than it was in my imagination before I started doing it. But the librarian was something that Li Du did end up kind of declaring to me. I was writing an early bit of dialogue with him, and I didn't have a career for him at the time. And he introduced him. I was just typing along, and he introduced himself, and he said, "I am," and I finished the sentence, "a librarian." And I think it really comes from, librarians are such archetypes in fiction. I'm always surprised when I look at, the deck of tarot cards that have these, the magician and the sorceress, that like the librarian isn't one of them. They play, they're the gateway to information and to stories, and they're so important in fiction. And one of my favorites is the father in Something Wicked This Way Comes is a dear character of mine, so I think librarians just was kind of meant to be.
And I think it gives him access to a lot of information at the time period that many other people wouldn't have, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as it developed, detectives, it's nice to give them a little bit of a skill, not supernatural, but some power that they have. And for Li Du, it is this memory that he has of his library and his ability to walk back through its halls and revisit the information, even as he's exiled and very far from home.
And you mentioned earlier that when you were growing up in Russia, you listened to Russian fairy tales. Did that influence the development of his sidekick Hamza?
It did. Hamza, dear Hamza. My mother kind of still doesn't know where Hamza came from. She said, Li Du, she's like, okay, he's kind of shy, he went to law school sort of, and then ended up being a librarian instead and likes to travel. Like, I get where you got that. But then Hamza, this kind of mischievous storytelling, liar, kind of came out of nowhere. But I think because the theme of the books that ended up emerging and being so important was the theme of storytelling and of how empires use narrative in the project of empire building, and how stories, I think sort of empires rise and fall on the strength of the stories they tell. So having a storyteller character was both a way to balance Li Du, as sidekicks do, and offer a different perspective on problems, but also to emphasize that when stories are told, someone is telling them, which is important to the plots.
And so you've got these two great characters to work with. What do you start with when you're creating the book in terms of developing the story? Are you a seat of the pants person? Are you an outliner? Do you do all your research up front? Do you do it as you go? Can you talk about that?
I am a crazy obsessive outliner, and I sort of didn't realize until I started talking to other writers that some are able to write and create as they go. I start with several months of extremely eclectic research. For the second two books, had some sense of my characters and the trajectory I imagined for them, but in terms of where exactly they would be set and what bigger historical context would be there, I spend maybe 2 months reading books, anything from the period, as many primary sources in translation as I can, but also going to museums and going just straight to the Asian art section and looking at the paintings, looking at the pottery, and anything that kind of grabs my attention. I'll read about it, and then you can just go into this vortex of information that isn't in the caption. You go find out more about it and more, and it leads to what I'm looking for, because ultimately I write mysteries, are motivations, anecdotes from the past that are about resentments and competitions and romance and jealousy, that sort of universal motives of murder mysteries. And as I start to find them, the plot emerges, and then I spend months making an outline, and then start writing and realize most of it doesn't work, and then redo the outline, and then go back to writing. So it's back and forth and back and forth.
And did for City of Ink, did the choice of Beijing as the location derive from this research, or did you say oh, it's time for us to go to the big city? Now that we've spent the first couple of books in the hinterlands, we want to see where the emperor lives. How did you decide on that?
That's a good question, and it was the latter. It was a sense that by that point I knew Li Du well. I knew his trajectory. I knew the things that he'd been avoiding facing in the first two books, and it came down to I couldn't, given the information he had by the end of White Mirror about the death of his mentor and the reason for his exile, I couldn't imagine him not going home and going back to his library and facing that past that he's been getting as far away from as possible. So at that point, it was something that I thought Li Du needed. So I had that set, and then I started to look more at what Beijing looked like at that time. And I started with the misconception that kind of Beijing was the Forbidden City, that the Forbidden City was the capital, and in fact the Forbidden City was the center, the palace, but around it was this walled, very socially complex, administratively layered capital city, and I found a lot of material there.
And I don't remember it ever being called Forbidden City in the book. Was it called that back then?
It wasn't really. So I debated whether to call it that, but yes, I think I ended up mostly referring to it as the palace or the emperor's home, because it really was just this enclave of the royal family and the administrative units directly related to them.
And it had a very interesting layout, and it was probably one of the biggest cities in the world, if not the biggest city at the time, even though it wasn't as well known in the West. How did you keep everything straight? Did you make a map of the city, or did you have it all in your head?
There is not a whole lot of information about Beijing at that time, but there is one fantastic resource, which was a map, a sort of survey map that was commissioned by Qianlong, who was a slightly later emperor than my time, but the city wouldn't have changed structurally since then. And it's this map. It's available online through a university website, a Chinese university website. And not only is it available online, but you can import it into Google Maps and overlay it on contemporary Beijing. So when I visited Beijing to do research, I could walk around holding a map that had a sort of transparent old map on top of it, so I could walk the distances between the buildings that I imagined and walk the length of the city walls, even though they're not there anymore. So it really felt like walking through the invisible past bones of a city that wasn't there. It was a really time-traveling experience. So that helped a lot.
And it's not a city with just an exterior wall. There are many, many walls inside that separated boroughs of the city.
Exactly.
With gates, which are very key to the story. Can you talk a little about that and how the city was laid out?
It stood out to me so much. So there were the huge outer wall, obviously, which was focused on defense of the city as a whole, but then the city was separated into two important halves, and one half was devoted to the Manchu, who were the sort of new rulers of China who had come in with the Qing dynasty. And when they had come in, they had ousted the Chinese nobility from this part of the city and put them down into the southern kind of marshy, unattractive bit. But by the time my book is set, this marshy, unattractive bit had turned into a kind of thriving cultural center. So you had the sort of Manchu, more warrior barracks of the north, and then the Chinese city in the south. But then within every neighborhood and every borough, there were walls and gates that closed on the bell, every night. And it really was this method of control that is one that we know today, sort of preventing people from easily gathering all in one big place. There weren't squares. Temples were very small. The city was really organized so that there was no space big enough to have an easy open gathering, especially after night. People were really just closed in, and I thought had a lot of potential.
Do you know what the population of the city was at that time?
I do
Yeah,
not.
it must be in the hundreds of thousands, at
That-
least, if not.
That
million.
sounds right, but I'm so terrible with numbers and dates. I'm so
It was
sorry.
just a very, very large city, probably the biggest in Asia, I'm guessing. And so, but it is a setting that may not be, especially in that time period, may not be as familiar to especially Western readers. Can you talk about the challenges of grounding the story enough in the time period to give it a sense of place, but still making it feel like accessible to our culture, and so that we can understand what's going on with not only with the setting, but with the objects they're handling that we may not know about, and things like that. Can you talk about that?
It's a great question and a challenge I really enjoy. The big basic answer with making any time period or setting accessible, I think, is creating characters that are accessible, that readers can relate to and identify with, and then experiencing the city and the setting through them. So I try to avoid objective narrator explanation because that kind of throws you out of the world and the story. But for mysteries, it really is particularly difficult because with mysteries you have. I like and try to write fair play mysteries, right? The kind where a reader has some chance of guessing who the killer is before the end. And if you want to do that, you give clues, right? Clues that the readers can identify. But to do that, you rely on a toolbox of things that readers will recognize. Things as simple as, murder weapons. So if you walk into a room or describe a room to a reader and you include in it a paperweight, right? And then later you have a character who is, killed by being bashed to the head. You can rely on the reader, clever reader, to remember that paperweight that was mentioned. But if you make it, an inkstone, that might not be something that a Western reader, knows what it is. It's just as heavy as a paperweight, would make a great murder weapon, but you kind of have to pause and explain what it is. And once you do that, you've called too much attention to it, and it loses its power as a subtle clue. So that's really the tough thing, trying not to over-explain when you want to give the reader credit and a chance to figure things out for him or herself.
And along those lines, I think another thing that may be a challenge for some readers is the names of the characters. And I thought you did a very good job of choosing names that were distinctive for all the characters so they wouldn't be confused. How do you choose names for your characters? And then how do you keep them straight? Do you keep a biography? Do you keep a list? How do you do that?
It's a good question. It is challenging because the Chinese names are just, because they're unfamiliar, they're hard. I do try to, at the most basic level, have the characters, the names start with different letters, so that can be just a bit of a cue. But for the main characters, their names are more meaningful and come from deeper places. Li Du's name has sort of double background, which was, so sometimes when you spend time in China, if there's a moment where you say something particularly eloquent in Chinese or make a close friendship, your Chinese friend will give you a Chinese name. Say like, time has come, you shall be, the name. And Li Du was the name that was actually given to my husband by Dr. Li, who believed that Li was the best name in China. So it was like, you will be Li. And then the second, Du comes from the word in Chinese for rhododendron, which is Du Zhen Hua. So it was a reference to his studying rhododendrons. So that name had sort of particular resonance. But the other names, I really do go on sound and feel and just trying to differentiate them as much as possible.
Do you speak Chinese?
Not well. I was so grateful for the patience and hospitality that we experienced during the 3 years that we were there, because we really were the village idiots of Lijiang, at going to the market and trying to order food. So I had survival Chinese, but I really relied on the kindness of our hosts to help.
And for the benefit of the writers who may be here or listening in, what is your writing process? Do you write every day? Do you write in the morning? And how long does it take you to write a novel?
I try to treat it like a 9 to 5 job, but I don't do that very successfully because I usually start really getting going at like 4 o'clock, and then so I'm afraid I'm still feeling my way to having a good process just in terms of time management and rhythm. I tend to go in bursts of inspiration where I don't get out of my pajamas for 10 days and then realize that wasn't a good idea and step away for a week. So it's a little bit wild and crazy, but in a fun way.
And does your legal education help in any way with creating the mysteries that you do?
It does. I really do give it a lot of credit because one of the things I didn't really realize when I went into law school, which I maybe should have thought a little bit harder about doing before I did it, I didn't realize that it would be less about learning specific laws and more about learning to think like a lawyer, to solve problems in a certain way. And so much of what you do in law school is you take the facts of a situation, which are infinite. When you look at something that really happens in life, you could go on for 1,000 pages trying to capture it, but you select from this infinite number of facts the ones that are relevant to the narrative that you want to construct, a persuasive narrative, and that process and that discipline really has a lot of overlap with writing fiction.
And you mentioned that you write fair play mysteries, which means an attentive reader can either solve it, or when you reveal the solution, they can go back and say, oh yes, I see where all the clues were laid out. How do you create the mystery and the solution? Do you know who the killer is when you start, or is that something you discover in the writing process?
It's from when I start. It's part of the before I really launch into writing, the things that have to be in place are the victim, the motive, and the identity of the killer. And I'm just amazed when I hear mystery writers who can write and figure it out as they go, because to me it really seems like a logic puzzle. I mean, it all has to be very skeletal and rigid if you want it all to go together. And people who can do that, who can make it up as they go, must be really good at chess. I don't know.
And the same for the clues. When you're going through and giving the clues about the killer's identity, do you know them as you go, or do you get to the end and go, oh wait, I need to plant those earlier so that it makes sense?
I think that's where the obsessive outlining comes in, because the clues are all there in the outline. So that skeletal structure of the mystery as a puzzle, and then it's when you go through and write and try to make the characters actually do the things to find those clues and solve those clues that it gets more complex, and you realize that character would never go into that room or think that way or ask that question, and then I have to go back and reevaluate maybe what those clues are going to be or how I'm going to get the detective to them.
Well, going into a few details of City of Ink without giving away any of the plot, I did have some questions about what is real and what is not real, because you make it seem like I don't know a lot about this era or place, but I believed everything you had in there was exactly as it was. And so I'm just curious. So, for example, you have an Article 285 of the Penal Code. Was there really a penal code that you used in this, or did you just make that up?
That is true. There is the Penal Code and Article 285. It was a direct quote from that Penal Code that has the law that a husband who discovers his wife in the act of infidelity and kills her and her lover can be potentially let off the hook given specific circumstances.
Where did you find this penal code?
There's a book called by Robert Hagel, nonfiction book called True Crimes in 18th Century China, and it goes through, it's sort of a legal textbook almost of case studies of actual crimes that occurred and how the magistrates dealt with them legally. So that was a really key resource.
And then there's this fantastic name of this incense called Dragon Brain Camphor.
Mm-hmm.
Is that real?
So I'm not sure if that, I think it's real, but I won't absolutely promise that. But the tradition of giving these very fanciful, romantic, exotic names to incenses that came from foreign places. So in that case, it was from Borneo. They were given these those kinds of names, if not that one exactly.
And then finally, there's a certain animal you have in the book that supposedly its manure was used as a luxury hair treatment.
Absolutely true.
Oh my God.
and that's the funny thing, right? The things that sound the most made up are usually the things that came from research.
Yes, and you will definitely remember when you get to that point in the book what animal that is. It's amazing. So there's you've written a book with a main character who is a Chinese man.
Mm-hmm.
You are not a Chinese man.
That is true.
There's a lot of discussion these days about cultural sensitivity and how appropriate it is for people of one culture or race writing a main character of another culture or race. Can you talk about any issues and whether you considered that when you started writing the book?
Definitely. Though, thanks for asking the question, because I think the issue of cultural appropriation is really important and something I did think a lot about as I was writing. And so many thoughts, and it's so complex. But to some extent, all writers steal. It's kind of what we do. Even an autobiographer, what writers do is they go out to the world and they take what they see, whether it's the shape of someone's hand or classified ad in a paper that inspires the idea for a story. But there is this broader problem when a writer takes an experience that isn't theirs and uses kind of privileges and opportunities available to him or her as a writer to write that, to tell that story when someone better qualified to tell it might not have those same privileges and opportunities. So I think that's just something that really has to be thought about. With historical fiction, there's that slight difference of we're relying on historical sources, not anyone who is alive or has had these experiences or can talk about them directly. So what I did was try to, as respectfully as possible, read all I could from the historical record and not misrepresent it. And then when it came to actually developing the character of Li Du, I think way back at the beginning, if any of you have read J. Dragon Mountain, Hugh Ashton, the bumbling botanist, was going to be my detective. He's an Englishman. But then I decided that, of the 30 total Westerners in China at that time, China didn't really need one of them to come and solve its mystery for it. It kind of seemed more appropriate to have a Chinese man be the detective. So I made that decision, and then it was a question of how to relate to him and how to make him honest and real without relying on stereotypes, which I think can be the problem. And the way I approached that was to have Li Du be a traveler in a place that was foreign to him, a place where he didn't speak the language, where he didn't know the culture, and in that, I could relate to him. And I think the experience of going into a culture you don't know is a pretty universal human one. So I could honestly connect to him on that and make him as as real and as deep as possible, given the limitations.
Yeah, and I think there might have been the white savior complex is also an issue. So I think you were smart in making your protagonist Chinese. Have you gotten any backlash or comments or support because of what you chose to to do?
I haven't, which is partly why I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a conversation I think we should be having, and that I think writers should be open to having, and not be defensive about or scared about, because ultimately what this is about is having more voices and more books and more perspectives, and that's always a good thing. So ultimately, what I encourage readers to do is to seek out writing by contemporary authors who can add to their works personal experiences of growing up in China or speaking Chinese or being Chinese academics, because those would be different and I think potentially really great books. One recommendation I have is there's a Tibetan author, I wrote his name down, who writes about so Sherlock Holmes, when he goes over the falls and then when he comes back, he tells Watson that he's been in Tibet during that lost time, and this Tibetan writer writes the story, the made-up story that happened in this time when Sherlock Holmes had disappeared, and his adventures in Tibet. I will find out what that is after. So yeah, seek out those stories is sort of the ultimate takeaway, I think.
Well, and because of making Li Du the central character, I think you've mentioned that you kind of foresaw this as at least a trilogy, which meant, did you have the central mystery that spans all three books in mind as you were doing that, or is that something that grew as you went?
A little bit of both, because what happened is I wrote Jade Dragon Mountain as a standalone, but because I had never written fiction before, I thought that one book could have a lot more in it than it actually can. So by the time I finished Jade Dragon Mountain, I had gotten rid of a massive amount of material. So when my editor said, would you like to write another one, I immediately had a sense of, all those things I had to delete were there and ready and waiting. So I was able to turn them into this bigger trajectory for Li Du and Hamza to some extent.
And so you have him coming to Beijing, so can you talk about why you chose the city, and particularly the fact that it's examination time, which is seems to be a central part of Chinese bureaucracy in that time period. Can you talk about that a little, because it's so central to the story?
It was one of those things that just glowed when I was doing research, was the unique circumstances around these civil examinations that happened in Beijing. Well, it happened first on a smaller level throughout the provinces, and then those who were at the top of the examinations all traveled from all over the empire according to this very complex quota system to sit for the examinations in Beijing. And in order to get a government job of any sort, which was the highest and most coveted thing you could do as an individual guy and for your family, you had to pass these examinations. But the number who passed them was tiny. It was like 200 students out of thousands taking them. And then the circumstances of taking the exams were just so brutal. They were locked in this walled examination yard, exposed to the elements in these little cubicles. And if they were sick, or even if a student died in the middle of the examinations, the doors wouldn't open. Their body would be passed over, thrown over the walls by the soldiers who were making sure they didn't cheat. And just the intensity and the superstitions that grew up around the examination hall, these fears of the mischievous spirits that haunted them and would, knock over your ink well in the middle of writing your exam and ruin your answers. There was just, the intensity of that time for storytelling and mystery and sort of high anxiety, high stress potential seemed too good to pass up.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was such an interesting aspect that I had no idea was, and the, that brings up the question of, it seems so relevant to today's time with all the bureaucracy we know existing, but I didn't know it was so such a major part of life in China. I mean, that's all Beijing were these administrators, administering this empire that spanned thousands of miles from this one place. Can you talk a little about how your books are relevant to a contemporary audience?
I try to make them so. I mean, it began with Jade Dragon Mountain and seeing so much contemporary relevance in the early interactions of China and the West, and how I felt that they paralleled some of the interactions today, and a lot of that had to do with, so at this time in China, there were very few Westerners allowed in. It was very, very closed off. There was no trade yet, with the East India Company, and the only ones allowed in were these Jesuits, and they were partly allowed in because of the technological innovations that they could offer, these astronomical instruments and building clocks and things for the emperor. But in reading some of the Emperor Kangxi, the Kangxi Emperor's own letters, it becomes clear how conflicted he was about accepting the help of foreign technological innovation, that he both was excited about this new power that it gave him, but also concerned about not producing these things internally, which just seemed so relevant to the way China thinks about technology and the influence of the West today. So that was one of the big ones. And then another one has just been the role of spectacle and narrative and storytelling in nation building. I think when I was in China, it was after, but there was still a lot of talk about the Olympics being held in Beijing, and just the spectacle that accompanied that, and that there was so much that felt similar to the Kangxi's, eclipse predicting huge show of empire, that also felt, that it had some relevance and just emotional accessibility.
And you mentioned that you went there in person to research with your map laid out over the current city. How much of the current city is still there from the 1711 setting that you have?
Almost nothing, really. There is the Forbidden City is there, but all of those walls that I talk about are gone. There's not even a hint of them. There's one tiny little section of the middle of the inner wall that you can go to just to see the stone, but it's a couple of 100 feet of wall, and other than that, the city has really, in its more recent history, rejected and torn down its past, and so it's a bit unique for doing historical research in that way.
So, who were some of your influences in getting into historical mysteries? What authors were really influential in you going in this direction with your writing?
I think the two biggest ones for me, the sort of classic from childhood, would be The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which I always felt combined storytelling, also powerful librarians in fiction with history, and also Ellis Peters, who writes the Cadfael mysteries, which I also read as a kid and then reread often, and I think they were very good models for me in using a historical setting, but allowing the priority and focus to be on these very individual characters and on these fictional narratives. And there's one other I was thinking. Oh, actually, John le Carré. I read when I was just starting to write. There was an old copy of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in one of the little expat cafes in Lijiang, and I read it, and I think I got a lot out of just studying his writing style and the way he dips into Smiley's head and out of it, and the narrative perspective was a big just teaching tool, since I hadn't written fiction before at that point.
And I would also say Agatha Christie, because not only because you mentioned her, but also because the feel of the book reminds me a lot of Hercule Poirot in the style that Li Du brings to his puzzle solving.
Thank you so much. I can't believe I didn't say Agatha Christie. It's like it goes unsaid, and I'm so glad you said it, because she is just the ultimate model for me. And I think if I ever taught English literature, I would teach I just think she's brilliant. I mean, her ability to sketch a character in half a sentence was, I think she is not given enough credit for her brilliance as a writer. I would study and reread her ad nauseum.
And so, what would you wish you had known when you started out doing this, and what advice would you give to people thinking of writing historical novels?
What would I wish I had known? I guess I would wish that I'd known that it's okay to have those moments where you realize you've written absolute nonsense. That, you know, they're the early moments of writing and failure are so intense and ultimately so important. And I wish I'd known that that's normal, and felt less devastated during the initial false starts of writing. And then in terms of advice, I guess I would say specifically with historical fiction would be to don't be scared of stepping away from the research, and don't let yourself drown in research, because the truth is infinite and infinitely complex. And at some point, if you're gonna make up a story, step away and just let your imagination do its thing.
And I think we'll open it up for questions
Right.
in a second. But before we do, I just want to finally ask you what's next for Lee Do and what's next for your writing.
So Lee Do is, let's see, can I say without spoilers? Lee Do is off having adventures that won't be specified, and I am momentarily stepping away from Lee Do but staying in the world, and the next novel will be a mystery set in the same time period but in London in 1703, in these early community of scientific collectors who were building these cabinets of curiosities and collections that would ultimately lead into the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. But it is a mystery.
Great, sounds exciting. Well, in this.
No, don't go away, because now it's going to be your turn. I just wanted to say, if you're really interested in China, you can drop back 1,000 years and read Robert Van Gulik's books about Judge Dee, which I cut my teeth on, and probably predisposed me to love Lee Do. And the bureaucracy under the Tang Dynasty was just as, and the examination system, as crucial as it was. I mean, it's remarkable. So I want to thank our Facebook audience for joining us this evening.